Would you be able to name some of the people that we're talking about here?
It would be inappropriate for me to do so at the moment. I would like to, and I have named them, and the names can be found, shall we say. But at the present time, I am under certain legal restrictions. I don't, because my prime aim and my prime legal responsibility is not only to detect and investigate crime, but also, if I have reason to believe further crimes are to be committed, I have a legal obligation to try and prevent those too. But I am very much aware that the opposition would like any excuse to imprison me again. So I'm not going to go so far as to goad people about things unnecessary, because the names I've put out are already in the public domain, so I don't really have to mention them again.
Yes, of course. And why is it that this particular case has been so heavily suppressed? Why is it not being picked up by the mainstream media? Why is it not on the front page of every major national newspaper?
You would think it would be done nationally and throughout the world, because Absolutely. It is far more serious than, it's very terribly difficult to compare cases, but when you think about the Fritzl case in Austria, where the father was raping his daughters and this sort of thing, that's a horrible thing. But this case is in extent is absolutely enormously bigger. And of course, as far as we know, there was no official cover-up to that story. There's a gigantic official cover-up on this story. But one of the reasons that it wasn't picked up was that in 2000, when Hollie first confessed first told her mother about the way she'd been abused from the age of, Hollie was 20 at the time, but it's clear she'd been abused from the age of 6. The person in charge in Aberdeen of the what you would call the Crown Prosecution Service in England, but the Procurator Fiscal's Office in Scotland, was a woman called Elise Angelini. She was a close associate of the judge who was involved in the rapes, and she decided that nothing should be proceeded. She blocked the whole investigation. In 2009, or late 2008, 2009, when I was brought in to try and help Anne and Hollie, I wrote to Mrs. Angelini, because we had documents showing that she was very much involved in it. We could actually prove with our point. Mrs. Angelini, very foolishly, decided to respond by saying that she knew nothing about the case. Now, what we did have, which we still have of course, is a letter to her dated the 27th of October 2000 from Anne and Hollie's own parliamentary representative, member of the Scottish Parliament, Brian Adam, directed to Mrs. Angelini, saying, "Dear Mrs. Angelini, blah blah blah, how are you getting on with the case?" This is the case that Mrs. Angelini claims she knew nothing about. And another letter dated the 28th of November, again from Mr. Adam to Mrs. Angelini, again asking her how she was getting along with his past inquiry and his past letter. And moreover, we have a letter dated the 12th of July 2001 from Mrs. Angelini's office with her name emblazoned across the top, written to Anne's solicitor, discussing aspects of the case. This is the case that the Procurator Fiscal, now the Lord Advocate of Scotland, the senior legal person in the whole of Scotland with equal power to the First Minister, has denied she knew anything about.
My word.
So you can see the efforts to block it. Now, what happened when I had exposed this, went back quite blatantly, hands in the till time, absolutely caught out here, was that I wrote to the First Minister and Alex Salmond, the Minister for Justice, Kenny McCaskill, and I said, the Lord Advocate is lying. She's absolutely blatantly lying about this terrible case. She's got to go. But they did nothing about it. Next thing we heard, when I was trying to get the mainstream media involved, was that I learned that Mrs. Angelini had been issuing threats, legal threats, to not only to the Scottish media, but even to international organisations like Google, not to mention the Hollie Greig case in any circumstances other than the full weight of the law of defamation would fall upon the media if they dared utter a word about the Lord Advocate's possible involvement in the Hollie Greig case. Now, the other interesting point is that Mrs. Angelini at the Crown Office has an army of state-funded lawyers there, but she didn't use any of those. She used a private firm called Levy and McRae, and she used the senior partner, Peter Watson to send out these threats, some of which I have actually seen. And Mr. Watson makes it quite clear that he's acting for Mrs. Angelini as a private individual. Now, once I learned this, and this was supposed to be kept, a secret. When I learned about this, I promptly contacted Mr. Watson and said, yes, I've got information that you are making threats against the mainstream media over the Hollie Greig case and the Lord Advocate's involvement in it. But who's paid your bill? Who's paid for that? So Mr. Watson, first of all, denied having anything to do with it, but obviously I had documents that I could prove that he did. So he had to climb down on that one. But then he still refused to answer my basic question, who paid for it? I said, if Mrs. Angelini paid for it personally, I have no objection. I think what she's done is terrible and she should face the full force of the law. But she's entitled to legal representation like anyone else. And if she personally paid for it, that's all right. I can't object to that. But of course, no answer came, which I think tells everything about it. This particular aspect of the story was picked up courageously by the editor of a magazine called The Drum, a legal magazine. It's not a fringe magazine, it's widely respected in the legal profession in Scotland. His name is Stephen Rayburn, and he picked up the point by saying, well, can you just tell us who paid for this? Was it paid for by Mrs. Angelini, or was it paid for by the Scottish taxpayer? And don't forget, it's the Scottish taxpayer who is actually having this story withheld from them. It's an attempt. It would seem almost certain that Mrs. Angelini has been abusing funds, public funds, to actually protect her from the Scottish people knowing all about this case, which they are perfectly entitled to know about. They really are. So at the present time, there's been quite a few legal ins and outs with the magazine and with Levy and McRae and Mrs. Angelini, but at the present time the newspaper are pressing for a judicial review because they have still suppressed this information and trying to avoid giving an answer to this basic question: who paid for all these threats from perhaps one of the most expensive law firms in Scotland against the media? That remains. I noticed a little article in one of the Glasgow papers just 2 days ago, still asking this question: Eilish Angelini, who paid the bill for you to threaten people over the Hollie Greig case? So we have a Lord Advocate who has resigned due to the pressure that we put on her on the 1st of October, which we're very pleased about. She should have been sacked ages ago, but she's still there, even though she's announced her coming resignation. But she still isn't answering those questions. I believe she has defrauded the Scottish people, and I also believe that she's responsible for covering up for some of the most horrendous crimes in Scottish history, and I hope it won't be long before she faces justice for all the terrible things that she has done.
A little bit about the consequences for yourself in pursuing this case. I mean, this has been a massive personal mission for you, and it's had tremendous consequences on you and your family.
Yes, it's been very difficult, but I knew what I was up against right from the start. It's really a question of doing what you think is the right thing once you know that the facts about this case, or what I believe to be the facts about this case. Of course, I tried everything to do it through normal channels. I'd written to the Scottish Government about all this. I tried to get the mainstream media involved. I'd written to the police again in Aberdeenshire, who are supposed to be investigating, whose duty it is to investigate it. But everything I did was sort of met with complete rebuttals. No one wanted to know. Everyone was playing the dead bat, hoping I'd just get fed up and go away. Well, I didn't. And in October 2009, I decided to make a public statement in Edinburgh. I called a public meeting and I invited the press, which one or two members did come along, and I decided I would name all the perpetrators whose names have been given to me by Hollie, and also I decided to name the victims, which took a little bit of thinking about because this is a very tricky thing. But I really wanted to find some way of opening up this story, so that is why I chose to do that. Nothing happened, even though I'd really come out absolutely publicly with all the names. There's a bit more correspondence flying about, but nothing of enormous significance. So I tried another tack then. It was obviously they were playing a stonewall game, trying to just wear me down. It was quite clear they couldn't defend themselves. All they could do was hope I would go away, but that was never going to happen. And so I decided that I would stand for Parliament, for the constituency in which most of the abuses had taken place, which was the constituency of Aberdeen South. So as I'd never been to Aberdeen in my life before, on February the 12th, I decided I would come and introduce myself to the people of Aberdeen. I would talk about the general sex of the child abuse case, because it was a threat to every child potentially in the city. And I must tell you, I think I overlooked before, a head teacher is involved in this as well, which is probably the most serious person of all to be, as they have this access to children. So I decided I would go and present myself at 10:30 in the morning outside a major store on Union Street, the main thoroughfare of Aberdeen. On Friday the 12th of February, I announced it to the press. I announced it as widely as I possibly could and said, I'm going to be there, I'm going to be handing out some leaflets. If you'd like to see me, see what I'm like, if I'm worth voting for, if you want to fire any questions at me, I'll be only too happy to comply. Didn't quite make it. As at 10, I was just walking along, I was going to get a sandwich from a local shop actually, just before I was going to talk. And I was just on a little back alley just off Union Street when I was pounced on by two CID officers who said, "Are you George Robert Green?" And I said, "Yes, I am, and we're here to arrest you on breach of the peace." And so they did, and they took me to the main police station where I was thrown into solitary confinement for the next 4 days.
Goodness.
So that was how it started. Obviously, I knew that the authorities were absolutely terrified by this time, despite the fact that they had publicly said that the case was closed and there was no evidence to proceed, and on and on and on, all the usual rubbish about this, all the usual cover-up nonsense. But after this, they were still prepared to throw me into prison, to shut me up. This actually obviously had it was not pleasant. I wouldn't kind of recommend being in a solitary confinement in a cell in a prison in Aberdeen. I'm not really sort of suggesting everybody should do that. But I did realise that we would really hit a nerve here, and they really had something to worry about. If I may digress slightly on this, because it's become very relevant at this point, is that the Scottish system has a very odd way of dealing with suspects at that particular time, in that you are not allowed to have any legal representation nor independent witness when interviewed by police officers. And also, you absolutely think about that, no representation, not at all. Suspect, the police can do anything they want. They could beat you up if they wanted to. Didn't happen to me. They could threaten your family if you didn't confess. They could do that. Or they could alter the taped transcript, which they certainly did in my case. So this all happened. I was staggered by this, and I thought, this is something out of the Dark Ages. Surely, wherever you go, mostly in Western Europe, Americas, this sort of thing, if you're arrested and you have the opportunity of having a lawyer present, have legal advice. Not only that, but the evidence that can be collected from such an interview is admissible under the Scottish court system. Would you believe? So you get threatened, you confess, and they say, "Wait, we've got you," and that goes to the court that you've confessed. They might want any tactic they want. And this apparently has gone on for the last 30 years. I realised, I didn't know at the time, I just thought it was some unfortunate anachronism of an antiquated legal system, because Scotland still has its own legal system. For those who are not aware of this, it's different from the rest of the United Kingdom. But I later found that they were actually signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights, and so in stopping me from having a legal representative, they were actually in breach of their own solemn agreement with the European human rights law. This has actually come about 3 weeks ago. This has actually been brought to the point of the kind of well-known CADA case, where this has been picked up. But the staggering thing is that in Scotland, every single conviction, and this includes 76,000 people, I am told, is fundamentally unsound. Because right from the start, people have been in a police cell with no legal representation, and the information that they may have given to the police at that time was counted as admissible evidence in court. It almost beggars belief that this is going on in a so-called Western country. And
would you be able to name some of the people that we're talking about here?
It would be inappropriate for me to do so at the moment. I would like to, and I have named them, and the names can be found, shall we say. But at the present time, I am under certain legal restrictions. I don't, because my prime aim and my prime legal responsibility is not only to detect and investigate crime, but also, if I have reason to believe further crimes are to be committed, I have a legal obligation to try and prevent those too. But when you think about the Fritzl case in Austria, where the father was raping his daughters and this sort of thing, I mean, that's a horrible thing. But this case is in extent, is absolutely enormously bigger. And of course, as far as we know, there was no official cover-up to that story. There's a gigantic official cover-up on this story. But one of the reasons that it wasn't picked up was that in 2000, when Hollie first confessed about or first told her mother about the way she'd been abused from the age of, Hollie was 20 at the time, but it's clear she'd been abused from the age of 6. The person I am very much aware that the opposition would like any excuse to imprison me again. So I'm not going to go so far as to goad people about things unnecessary, because the names I've put out are already in the public domain, so I don't really have to mention them again.
Yes, of course. And why is it that this particular case has been so heavily suppressed? Why is it not being picked up by the mainstream media? Why is it not on the front page of every major national newspaper?
You would think it would be done nationally and throughout the world, because Absolutely. It is far more serious than, I mean, it's very terribly difficult to compare cases, but we could actually prove our point. Mrs. Angelini, very foolishly, decided to respond by saying that she knew nothing about the case. Now, what we did have, which we still have of course, is a letter to her dated the 27th of October 2000 from Anne and Hollie's own parliamentary representative, member of the Scottish Parliament, Brian Adam, directed to Mrs. Angelini, saying, "Dear Mrs. Angelini, blah blah blah, how are you getting on with the case?" This is the case that Mrs. Angelini, in charge in Aberdeen of the what you would call the Crown Prosecution Service in England, but the Procurator Fiscal's Office in Scotland, was a woman called Elise Angelini. She was a close associate of the judge who was involved in the rapes, and she decided that nothing should be proceeded. She blocked the whole investigation. In 2009, or late 2008, 2009, when I was brought in to try and help Anne and Hollie, I wrote to Mrs. Angelini because we had documents showing that she was very much involved